I woke up from emergency surgery to a nurse. I didn't recognize standing over my bed, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted my IV line, waiting, it seemed, for the room to empty before she spoke. The anesthesia was still thick in my system, the ceiling tiles above me swimming faintly in and out of focus, and for a moment I genuinely thought I was imagining the tension in her voice. "Mrs. Calloway," she said quietly, glancing once toward the door. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm while I do." If she hadn't stayed at the nurse's station 3 minutes longer than her shift required, I might never have learned that my husband had already drafted the paperwork to take over my half of our company, contingent on exactly the outcome. He'd just told hospital staff not to bother him unless it happened. My name is Naomi Calloway. I was 39 years old, 2 days out from an emergency appendectomy that had nearly ruptured before anyone caught it, when a nurse who had no professional obligation to tell me anything at all decided that I deserved to know what my husband had said in the hallway outside my room. Denise Okonkwo wasn't even my assigned nurse. She covered a different wing of the surgical floor entirely, and I'd exchanged maybe 2 sentences with her in the 2 days since my surgery, mostly polite hallway greetings when our paths happened to cross. She told me later that she'd almost talked herself out of coming back to my room at all, that the entire walk down the hallway, she kept rehearsing reasons to turn around, that professional boundaries existed for good reasons, and she'd never once in 11 years of nursing crossed one like this before. "I kept thinking about my own mother," she told me, months later, once we'd become genuinely close. "She had a husband who wasn't much better than yours turned out to be, and nobody ever told her anything until it was far too late to matter. Preston and I built Calloway Property Group together 14 years ago, both of us 28 and reckless enough to leave stable jobs at competing real estate firms to start something of our own. I remember the exact spreadsheet we built together on my kitchen table the week we quit, mapping out 18 months of runway from our combined savings, both of us terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. For the first 6 years, we were equal partners in every real sense of the word, my name on half the paperwork, my signature on every major deal, my instincts for which properties would actually turn a profit proving right, often enough that Preston used to introduce me at industry dinners as the reason this company has any money at all. I specialized in undervalued properties in transitional neighborhoods, a skill Preston openly admitted he didn't share. And more than one of our biggest early wins came directly from deals he'd initially wanted to pass on. I remember one property in particular, a derelict warehouse Preston thought was a waste of our limited capital, that I insisted on pursuing anyway, converted 18 months later into loft apartments that became, for years, the highest-grossing single asset in our entire portfolio. Preston brought it up at every company anniversary for nearly a decade, a running joke about trusting my judgment, even when his own instincts said otherwise. When our son Caleb was born, I stepped back from day-to-day operations, the way so many women in my position do, trusting Preston to keep the company's paperwork and my own ownership stake exactly where they'd always been. I told myself, the way I suspect most women in this exact position tell themselves, that it was a temporary adjustment, that I'd ease back into a more active role once Caleb was older, that the trust I was extending, Preston cost me nothing, because we were, after all, still equal partners on paper. The signs, in hindsight, had been building for nearly a year before that hospital bed. Preston started keeping the company's financial meetings to himself, citing my reduced involvement as the reason I no longer needed to sit in. He mentioned a deal with a group called Hendricks Capital, with increasing frequency, always vaguely, always changing the subject when I asked for specifics, telling me once, with a flash of irritation that surprised me, that I didn't need to worry about the details of a company I'd basically stepped away from. I remember sitting with that sentence for a long time afterward, turning it over, feeling something in me quietly bristle at being described as having stepped away from something I'd built with my own hands. But I let it go, the way I'd let go of a dozen smaller frustrations that year, each one easier to swallow than the fight I sensed waiting underneath it. There was an evening, about 2 months before the surgery, when I asked Preston directly whether the company had received any recent acquisition interest, having heard Hendricks Capital's name mentioned at a neighbor's dinner party by someone who worked in commercial lending. Preston's answer was quick, almost too quick. Nothing serious, just preliminary conversations, not worth getting into. Delivered with the practiced ease of a man who had clearly prepared that exact deflection in advance. I remember going to bed that night with a small, persistent unease I couldn't quite name, the kind that settles into the base of your throat and doesn't fully leave. I almost brought it up again the following week, and then didn't, telling myself I was imagining tension that wasn't really there. The same way I'd talked myself out of a dozen smaller doubts over the preceding year. There was another moment closer to the surgery. When I noticed Preston had started locking his home office door, something he'd never done in 14 years of us, sharing that space for late-night work sessions and casual conversation alike. When I mentioned it, lightly, over dinner, he said something about client confidentiality requirements that hadn't existed the year before, and I let the explanation stand, unexamined, the way I'd apparently trained myself to let most of his explanations stand by then. I collapsed at home 3 days before the surgery, a burst appendix I'd mistaken for a stomach flu, for nearly 36 hours before Caleb, 12 years old and frightened, called an ambulance himself. I remember very little of the ride to the hospital, only Preston's voice on the phone, somewhere in the background, oddly steady, oddly businesslike, telling someone he'd handle things from here, in a tone that, at the time, I mistook entirely for reassurance. Denise pulled a chair close to my bed, glancing once toward the door before continuing. "I wasn't trying to listen," she said. "I was charting outside your room when your husband stepped into the hallway to take a call." He didn't lower his voice much. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she spoke, and I found myself, strangely, reaching over to steady them with my own, still weak from surgery but wanting, somehow, to offer her the same reassurance she was working so hard to offer me. He said, "Don't call me unless she's dead. I've got the Hendricks closing tomorrow, and I can't have this derailing it." I almost let it go, honestly. People say careless things in hospital hallways all the time when they're stressed. But then he said something else. About 10 minutes later, on a second call, he asked whoever he was talking to whether the paperwork would still hold up. If things went the other way with Naomi, his words, not mine, and whether a surviving spouse's signature would even be required. She paused, watching my face carefully. "Mrs. Calloway, I've worked in this hospital for 11 years. I've heard families process fear in every strange way imaginable. This didn't sound like fear, it sounded like planning. I lay very still in that hospital bed, IV line taped to the back of my hand, and felt something in my chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the anesthesia, still working its way out of my system. "Did he say who he was talking to?" I asked. "Someone named Marcus," Denise said. "I heard him say Marcus twice, and Hendricks at least 4 times. She hesitated a moment before adding, quieter now, "I almost didn't tell you. I kept thinking it wasn't my place, that maybe I'd misheard, that stress makes people say things they don't mean." But something about the second call didn't sound stressed at all. It sounded rehearsed. I called my closest friend, Yvette, that same afternoon, still weak, still tethered to a hospital bed, and asked her to do something I hated asking of anyone. To go to my house, while Preston was at the office, and quietly photograph anything on his desk that looked like company paperwork. Yvette had been my closest friend since business school, sharp and unflappable in exactly the way I needed. In that moment, the kind of friend who'd once helped me move apartments twice in one summer without ever once complaining, who'd sat with me through my father's funeral without needing to fill the silence with anything at all. She didn't hesitate for a second before agreeing, telling me simply, "Give me 20 minutes, I'll call you back." She called me back within 2 hours, her voice tight with the particular discomfort of someone who has just found exactly what she was afraid of finding. "Naomi, there's a document here titled Contingency Transfer, Surviving Partner Provisions. It's dated 8 days ago. It's already drafted, ready for signature. In plain terms, It would let Preston claim emergency control of your half of the company if you were ever declared incapacitated or dead, without needing your signature on anything. 8 days ago, 4 days before I'd even collapsed at home, I lay in that hospital bed doing the math over and over, unable to make the timeline mean anything other than exactly what it appeared to mean. The second thing came from Yvette's own quick research that same evening. Hendricks Capital, it turned out, wasn't a new client at all, but a private equity group actively courting Callaway Property Group for a full buyout, a deal Preston had apparently been negotiating for months, without ever once mentioning it to me, his equal partner on every piece of paperwork that still legally existed. The buyout, structured as currently drafted, would only close cleanly. Yvette's contact in commercial real estate explained, if ownership sat entirely with one signer, rather than being split, contested, or complicated by a partner, suddenly unable to participate in negotiations. This isn't just bad timing on his part, Yvette said, her voice careful. This looks like the entire deal was structured around your absence being permanent, or at least legally convenient. I asked her to send me everything she could find on the deal's actual valuation. And when the number came back later that night, I understood, with a fresh wave of nausea that had nothing to do with my surgery, exactly how much money had apparently been worth more to Preston than simply waiting for me to wake up and have a conversation. The third thing I learned directly from the hospital's own patient services coordinator, a soft-spoken woman named Rita, who called to check on my discharge paperwork and mentioned entirely without guile that my husband had called that morning asking about typical recovery timelines for appendectomy patients with complications, specifically whether such patients sometimes experienced unexpected setbacks in the days following surgery. Rita had answered his questions professionally, assuming he was simply an anxious spouse, and only mentioned the exchange to me because she wanted to reassure me that my own recovery was, in fact, progressing normally with no cause for the kind of concern he'd apparently been asking about. I told him complications after this type of surgery are actually quite rare once someone's passed the first 48 hours, she said cheerfully, entirely unaware of what that reassurance had actually confirmed for me. I thanked her for the information and hung up the phone with a hand that had, for the first time since waking up in that bed, started to genuinely shake, understanding now that Preston hadn't simply been drafting contingency paperwork out of some abstract legal caution. He had been actively hoping for exactly the outcome Rita had just told him, unknowingly, was unlikely to happen. I asked Denise to help me arrange one thing before I confronted Preston, a call to hospital security, explaining carefully that I had reason to believe a family member visiting that afternoon might attempt something I needed a witness present for. Denise made the call herself, standing beside my bed while I listened, her voice calm and professional in a way that steadied me more than I expected it to. The security supervisor, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Ortiz, agreed to have an officer positioned quietly outside my room during visiting hours, discreet enough not to alarm anyone, present enough to matter if I needed her. I spent the 2 hours before Preston's expected arrival doing what I could to prepare, weak as I still was, reviewing the photographs Yvette had sent of the contingency document, writing out, in a shaky hand on hospital notepaper, the exact sequence of facts I intended to lay out, the same instinct for careful preparation that had once made me good at closing difficult real estate deals, now turned toward an entirely different kind of negotiation. Denise checked on me twice during that window, once bringing a cup of tea I barely touched, telling me quietly, "Whatever you decide to do, I'm glad I told you. You deserve the chance to decide for yourself." I thanked her, meaning it more than my voice probably conveyed, still working, to steady my own hands enough to hold the pen. Preston arrived at exactly 2, the same time Yvette had confirmed through a contact of her own that the Hendricks closing call was scheduled to begin. He came in carrying flowers, the picture of a concerned husband, and I watched him arrange his face into practiced warmth as he approached my bed. "How are you feeling?" "I've been so worried." "Have you?" I said, my voice even deliberately calm. Because Denise tells me you said not to call you unless I was dead. That doesn't sound like worry. That sounds like scheduling. His face shifted, the warmth draining out of it in real time. His hand tightening slightly around the flowers he was still holding. I don't know what you're talking about. The contingency transfer document, I said, keeping my voice level despite the effort it took. Dated 8 days before I collapsed. The one that would have let you claim emergency control of my half of the company without needing my signature at all if I hadn't made it through surgery. The call to patient services asking about unexpected surgical setbacks. Would you like me to keep going, or should we just wait for your 2 o'clock call with Hendricks? Since I understand that's happening right about now, and I'd genuinely love to hear how you're planning to explain a surviving partner clause to a company that still, as of this exact moment, has both partners very much alive. Naomi, whatever you think this looks like, it looks like you called a nurse to ask whether complications after appendectomy surgery are common, I said, cutting him off, my voice steady even as my hands, hidden beneath the blanket, weren't quite as steady as I wanted them to be. It looks like you drafted paperwork 8 days before I even collapsed. It looks like you told hospital staff not to bother you unless I died. I'm not asking you to explain what it looks like, Preston. I already know exactly what it looks like. Preston's phone began ringing in his pocket at almost that exact second, and I watched him glance down at it, then back at me, his composure fully gone now, the flowers finally set down on the nearby table with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Naomi, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, I said. I have the document. I have a nurse who heard both phone calls. I have hospital security standing outside that door. Answer the phone, Preston. Tell Hendricks the deal just changed. He didn't answer it. The phone rang out, then began ringing again almost immediately, insistent, and I watched something in Preston finally break. Not remorse, exactly, but the particular collapse of a man watching a carefully built plan come apart faster than he'd prepared contingencies for. Officer Ortiz stepped quietly into the doorway at that moment, drawn, I suspect, by the raised volume of Preston's own voice more than anything Denise or I had done, her presence calm but unmistakably deliberate. Preston glanced at her, then back at me, and I watched the last of his composure fully drain away. 14 years, I said quietly, into the silence that followed. I built half of that company with you, Preston. I would have signed anything you actually asked me to sign, if you'd simply asked. You didn't have to plan around me being gone. You just had to talk to me. Hendricks Capital withdrew from the deal within 72 hours. Their legal counsel, citing material misrepresentation regarding ownership structure and partner consent. Once Yvette's attorney contact sent formal notice that any transfer required my direct, documented signature. Never obtained, never even requested. The deal Preston had spent months quietly building collapsed entirely. The private equity group's due diligence team apparently unwilling to touch a transaction with active fraud allegations attached to it, regardless of how the underlying real estate portfolio actually performed. Marcus, the associate Preston had been coordinating with, sent a curt email to Preston within the week, formally ending the firm's involvement, a copy of which found its way to me through Yvette's contact. The final line reading simply, "Given the nature of what's surfaced, we won't be revisiting this opportunity." The fallout within Preston's professional circles moved quickly once the story became impossible to contain. 2 commercial brokers who had worked with Callaway Property Group for over a decade quietly redirected their listings to a competing firm within the month, one of them telling a mutual colleague she didn't feel comfortable doing business with someone who'd tried to legally erase his own wife. A local business journal that covered regional real estate deals ran a brief item on the collapsed Hendricks acquisition, noting only that it had fallen through over unresolved ownership disputes. Language vague enough to protect the specifics, but pointed enough that anyone paying attention in our industry understood something serious had happened. I filed for divorce 2 weeks after I was discharged, along with a formal legal complaint against the contingency document itself, which Yvette's attorney successfully argued constituted an attempted fraudulent transfer of marital business assets. Preston's own attorney, reviewing the timeline, the documents dating, Denise's account, the hospital's own records of his calls to patient services, advised him against contesting the divorce settlement extensively. And I retained full ownership of Callaway Property Group, the company I'd built with my own hands 14 years earlier, and never should have let anyone convince me I'd stepped away from. Preston walked away from the marriage with a small minority stake I allowed him to retain, largely, if I'm honest, because Yvette's attorney advised that a cleaner, faster settlement served me better than a prolonged fight over every remaining dollar. The finalization hearing lasted barely 15 minutes. Both of us seated at separate tables with our attorneys, while a judge read through the settlement terms in the flat, efficient tone of someone who had clearly presided over hundreds of similar mornings. Preston didn't look at me once during the reading. I found I didn't particularly need him to, focused instead on the small, steady relief of watching 14 years of careful, quiet work finally get formally, legally confirmed as entirely mine to keep. Caleb took the divorce hard in the particular way 12-year-olds process news too large for the vocabulary they currently have available to them. I sat him down once I was home and strong enough and told him a simplified but honest version of what had happened, careful not to turn his father into a cartoon villain, even as I was honest about the facts. He was planning around me not making it, I told him. That's not something I can pretend didn't happen, even though I know it's hard to hear about your dad. Caleb was quiet for a long time, and then asked, in the direct way children sometimes manage better than adults, would Denise have told anyone else, or just you? I don't know, I said honestly. I think she told me because she happened to be the one who heard it, and she happened to be someone with a conscience. I got lucky in that specific way, even in the middle of a very unlucky week. Caleb struggled with his father's diminished presence in his life over the following year. The custody arrangement reduced to alternating weekends that Preston, by all accounts, didn't always fully show up. For even then, I watched my son work through a grief that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with realizing a parent wasn't quite who he'd believed. A particular kind of loss I recognized intimately, having spent that same year working through a version of it myself. Preston's name, once synonymous with the company's public face at every industry mixer for over a decade, started appearing less and less at those same events, and by the following year, several colleagues mentioned to Yvette that they simply hadn't seen him around much anymore. 6 weeks after the divorce settlement was finalized, I held a small internal meeting with the company's senior staff, most of whom had worked alongside both Preston and me for years and had watched the entire situation unfold through fragments of office gossip and the occasional confirmed detail. I decided, after much deliberation with Yvette, that the team deserved a clear, honest account rather than continued speculation, and I told them plainly what had happened. The contingency document, Denise's warning, the collapsed Hendricks deal. The room was quiet for a long moment after I finished, several people exchanging glances, before one of our longest-tenured project managers, a soft-spoken man named Elias, who'd been with the company almost since the beginning, stood up at the end of the meeting and said simply, "We're glad you're the one still standing here telling us this." The rest of the room nodded, several people voicing quiet agreement, and something in that small, unremarkable moment of collective solidarity did more to steady me than almost anything else in the entire ordeal. Elias told me afterward, privately, that he'd always sensed something had shifted in how Preston talked about the company over the past year, a subtle erasure of my role in conversations that he'd noticed, but hadn't known how to name at the time. The company's revenue grew nearly 40% in the 2 years, following the divorce, largely, I think, because I finally stopped operating like someone who had stepped away from her own creation and started operating like the person who had actually built it. I renamed one of our signature developments, a mixed-use project I'd personally designed the concept for a decade earlier, after my grandmother, a small, private act of reclaiming a piece of the company's identity that had nothing to do with Preston at all. I also instituted a formal governance policy requiring dual signatures on any contingency or succession planning documents involving company ownership, a policy the board adopted unanimously, and one I insisted on naming, half seriously, the Denise clause in honor of the person whose 3 extra minutes had made all of it necessary in the first place. Denise and I still exchange holiday cards, 4 years running now. I sent her flowers the week the divorce was finalized, and a note that simply said, "You stayed 3 extra minutes. I got to keep everything because of it." She wrote back that she thought about that day often, how close she'd come to simply charting quietly and going home, and how glad she was that she hadn't. She told me in a later card that the story had quietly circulated among some of her nursing colleagues, and that more than one of them had told her they hoped they'd have made the same choice in her position. I threw myself back into Callaway Property Group over the following year, once my recovery was complete and the legal proceedings had settled, in a way I hadn't allowed myself since Caleb was born. I brought on 2 new junior associates, both women, both sharp, in ways that reminded me of myself at 28, and made a point in every partnership agreement the company signed going forward of building in protections I'd never once thought to insist on for myself. Yvette, who had been quietly encouraging me to expand for years before any of this happened, finally got the answer she'd been waiting for. When I asked her to join the company formally as a strategic partner, a decision that felt, in a strange way, like closing one chapter of trust by opening a much sturdier one. I think about that hospital bed often, the particular vulnerability of being told the person who's supposed to protect you has instead been quietly calculating what your absence might be worth. I don't think Denise's warning saved my life, not literally. But I think it saved me from waking up healthy only to discover, weeks or months later, exactly how much had already been signed away while I wasn't paying close enough attention. I think, too, about the 2 months before the surgery, the locked office door. I never questioned closely enough the deflected question about Hendricks Capital that I let go without pushing further. I've made a kind of peace with that silence, the same way I've made peace with every quiet accommodation I made in the year before Denise finally spoke up. I wasn't foolish for trusting Preston as long as I did. I was a woman who had built a genuine partnership with someone, once, and had never fully updated my understanding of him, even as the person standing in front of me, quietly, methodically became someone else. It took a nurse who had no obligation to get involved at all to remind me that trust, once extended fully, still has to be checked on periodically, not simply assumed to still be exactly where you left it 14 years earlier. Preston reached out once, about a year after the divorce, a short email that read in its entirety, "I know sorry doesn't cover what I tried to do. I think about it more than you'd probably believe." I didn't respond right away, sitting with the email open on my screen for the better part of an evening, turning over whether any response was owed at all. In the end, I closed the laptop without writing back. Not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't feel I owed him the labor of accepting an apology for a plan that had, quite literally, been built around the possibility of my death being convenient to him. Some things, I've decided, don't require a reply to be fully closed. Caleb is 16 now, and Callaway Property Group carries both our names on its letterhead somewhere down the line, a detail he likes to point out to friends with a mixture of pride and dry humor. That reminds me more than almost anything else, exactly why rebuilding all of this was worth every difficult month it took. Some evenings, sitting in my office long after everyone else has gone home, I still catch myself thinking about the particular strangeness of owing so much to a stranger who happened to be standing in the right hallway at the right moment. I've stopped trying to calculate exactly how differently things might have gone if Denise had simply clocked out on time that day, the way any reasonable person might have. I've settled, instead, for being the kind of person now who notices things too, who asks a second question when something feels slightly off, who no longer assumes that trust, once given, doesn't need to be periodically checked on. 14 years taught me how to build a company. That one hospital stay taught me how to actually watch over it, and over myself, in a way I'd apparently never quite gotten around to learning before. If you've ever trusted someone with the parts of your life you couldn't personally watch over, and wondered, even briefly, whether that trust was still where you left it, I hope you remember this. It's never too late to look closely again. Even from a hospital bed, even when looking closely is the very last thing you have energy left for. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has anyone ever protected you at a moment you were too vulnerable to protect yourself? Leave a comment below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. We share stories like this one every day. Stories about quiet courage, unexpected protectors, and the moment someone finally decides silence isn't worth the cost. If you'd like to be part of that journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourself. And remember that the people worth trusting are the ones who show up even when no one's watching to see if they will.